Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Lost Origin, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code, Omnipoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be going over our early thoughts on a Lost Origin tier list. We've started to see some online results, but nothing IRL, nothing concrete just yet. So this is going to be based on our initial theory crafts, as well as a little bit of online results that we've seen so far. Of course, for some of these newer decks, we will have just had our own testing to base this off of, and for plenty of the current decks, we already know quite a lot about them. But Jack's here with me, and we're going to start getting into some of these decks. So, Jack, do you want to pick one first?
Yeah, let's kick things off with one of these one prize decks. I feel like one prizes have been a big beneficiary of this new set. We'll start off with we'll just start off with the Cram Greninja Mirage Gate.
Sure.
That we've got down here. So we're gonna stick this in 1.5. Like I say, I feel like the one prize deck, so this Lost Zone engine has really opened the gate for a lot of one prize decks that actually have brought something new to the game. We've seen a lot of two prizes recently, and the game has been very focused on like Intellion engines. So I think the whole Comfey engine is a real breath of fresh air, to be honest. And I think Cram alone is enough to warrant trying to build around this engine and not try and use these two prizes that maybe benefit from the Lost Zone engine as well. I think Cram's a fantastic card. And you can see a couple of different Cram variants. It's that strong a card. There's lots of different ways to build this. This is more looking at some of the spreading options. Obviously, Sableye is a big Lost Zone sort of payoff card. So being able to play some Sableyes and sort of deal with other engines, combining that with Mirage Gating onto Radiant Greninjas, which obviously before it was really only Palkia decks that could ever Radiant Greninja particularly effectively. Now basically every deck can, because it can play a Mirage Gate engine and it can access Radiant Greninja. And to be honest, Greninja was in a load of different decks anyway, just as a fantastic draw option. So now it being a potential attacking option in a lot of decks is really scary, to be honest. This is kind of that. This is kind of focused on dealing sort of nice chip damage with the Cramorant, having lots of sniping potential, having lots of damage counter placement, and really trying to ruin a lot of other setups. It can kind of struggle sometimes with some of the bigger HP sort of 2 and 3 prizes, sort of the big Arceuses or the big 3 prizes here and there, just because typically you're trying to pick off prizes more so than necessarily take big KOs. Whereas sort of a Radiant Charizard build that we'll talk about momentarily may be a bit better at. But in general, like I say, I think this is one of the decks that actually shows off the Lost Zone engine the best. It's really, really strong in how it can sort of navigate through the early turns. You can draw a huge amount of cards, which obviously some of these one prize decks that were built around Intellion in the past had that shooter aspect. Turns out with Comfey, with lots of nets and switching options and that kind of thing, as well as just Greninja, you can get into high hand sizes pretty easily. So yeah, lots of options, not quite reaching that tier 1 category, just because there's still a lot of two prize decks that sometimes, if there's enough HP and if their board state is big enough that you're not able to actually punish and take a couple of small prizes here and there on things like Sobbles, Manaphy's, all of that kind of stuff, can get a little bit difficult. But I think this is a deck that actually sort of emphasizes how powerful or how diverse this Lost Zone engine is the most.
Yeah, I think this build as well invalidates a lot of other one prizes because it comes out the gate faster, oftentimes with Cram, and it has so much flexible damage and spread damage at its disposal, where Manaphy is normally our protection. Sableye kind of makes a mockery of that because it can easily just continually recover Sableye, knock out a Manaphy just as you keep recovering it, and they're getting additional value from extra counter placement, so there's no real way to protect you from Greninja plays, so very flexible damage. I guess I will talk about one of the key counterparts that we think is going to be as successful, if not a little bit more, is going to be similar to a build that we've shown on the channel so far, a Cramorant build that has a bit more of an aggressive uptick in terms of just raw damage potential, and that is with the Radiant Zard Magma Basin package. really taking a lot of spaces away from the energy counts that you play. Of course, part of the reason why the Mirage Gate kind of works is because you have the Radiant Greninja to use those energy cards as draw, so they're not just bricks. Whereas in this build, you just have much more space where you're only using a couple Psychic, like 2 to 3 Fire, and like maybe some captures if you just want to have extra outs for basics. So with that space, you get to play like the full 4 copies of Escape Rope, for example, which is really helpful at defending yourself against Empoleons, which is a really big deal. You have a lot of space for belts as well, which I think are really important. I'm actually at the full 4 copies of Choice Belt in this sort of build because A, it's amazing with Zard, but B, it's really good with Cramorant. If you can just chain those Choice Belts, you can be two-shotting V-Star Pokemon very, very easily and getting some nice trades in, knowing that your late game becomes so strong with that Zard, especially if you can rinse and repeat it a couple times. I know there's a small fear that you can get your Radiant Zard sort of lost citied and you can only get 1 activation out of the card, but I don't think that's actually a huge issue for this list because you already have a lot of Cram use, a lot of Sableye use. You can work a game plan around in such a way that you only need to Zard once. And I think especially against Mew, which is one of the sort of key decks in the game that is playing Lost City, if you play 1 Zard, 1 Drapion, you easily win that matchup regardless. I don't think it's an issue that you could be facing some Lost City stuff because A, Mew's kind of the main one using it right now, and B, you can build your plan around only Zarding 1 time, and I think that's a really big deal.
Yeah. Just to wrap things up with the Cramorant decks, we're going to take the sort of the combination of the Big Prize and Mirage Gate version, and we're going to drop that in tier 2. Essentially, it feels a little bit worse. It feels like it's trying to combine both of these strategies, trying to have this big damage output from typically Radiant. Amazing Rare Reshiram, but also because you're playing Fires anyway, it's very, very appealing to just be playing Radiant Zard as well. But obviously you need to be able to power that up, so you're going to be playing the Mirage Gate engine, which then means that you're maybe looking to add in elements of the Sableye package or the Greninjas, if you're not playing the Zard or the Greninja or whatever, and it all culminates to try and build like a techie 1 prize list that, in general, probably has like more options overall, but you fill your deck out with way more. By filling your deck out with way more options, you actually start to hurt the consistency, which is actually something that it is really nice about the Lost Zone engine is how many cards you can just tear through in a turn. All of a sudden, if you have lots of these combo pieces and you need to save things for later or whatever, it starts to get a bit complicated here and there. And in general, like I say, it probably has more options than either one of those 2 decks individually, but because it's trying to pull off both of these things, it does them less effectively. That's not to say the deck's particularly bad. It's still tier 2 in our eyes. It still can deal with a lot of the threats that are out there, and having options to be able to do the big damage, but also set things up, sprinkle things with the Sableye and stuff like that, and just still having that Cram as an option is still really, really nice, but we feel it doesn't quite do what it's trying to do as effectively as either of those 2 decks. So picking a path, whether it's the big damage one hit KO path or trying to cripple people's setups, typically going down one of those paths and focusing and honing in your deck on one of those options will get you into, or will typically do a bit better for you. Obviously, there will be instances where you'll try and do it all, and they'll sort of the dream will be met, and you'll be able to do all of this stuff where you're not worried about a big 2 prize, or you're not worried about these little sort of smaller Pokemon that you can also deal with. But in general, trying to focus all of that into one deck does hurt the consistency and does drop it down to that tier 2 in our eyes.
Let's talk about Mew. We're going to bung this back into tier 1. I think there's been times where it may have been floating around that 1.5 mark, but I think we've got to a point in the metagame, maybe it's just early copium and everyone's just trying out the new stuff and having fun, but it seems like there's such a diverse pool of decks from this Lost Zone engine that there's just like so much that's viable right now that it eats up the meta share, most importantly, of Arceus decks. I think there's so much aggressive 1-hit KO potential in the format from some new contenders like Giratina, like Hisuian Zoroark, like Kyurem VMAX. It makes life awkward for Arceus in the game as a whole, and Arceus decks are the ones that start having the 3 and the 4 copies of Path to the Peak, and when you start seeing those deplete, you're very happy as Mew, because sure, Palkia can play a path and like try and Roxanne path you once in the game, but you still have all of your ball search outs for Pumpkaboo at that stage, and you can still play a high count of stadiums, so I feel like just less path in the game is only good news for Mew. I know there is the potential for Drapion, For me, I feel like it's not going into a ton of decks. It doesn't make sense in a ton of decks, really. The only thing I would say is that because of Drapion V, I'm much more inclined to go back to a Meloetta build. I know people have had fun with the 4 DTE builds and they have more space and they can do lots of different things with your Mew VMAXs jumping around back into the deck, etc. And you can enjoy some tankability. But like I just said, there's more stuff that invalidates tankability anyway, that it makes more sense to just be another racing deck. And you can hit the ground running with Meloetta, maybe even playing those catches as well, so you can efficiently do that 2-2-2 race and high roll the highest, basically. I feel like it's definitely a valid strategy in the game. I think there's less path, and that's kind of the main selling point. I know there's a lot of Lost City going into Mew right now. I'm kind of so-so on it, to be honest. I'm not like really sold because it doesn't grant you that much value. You know, you still want to have a high count of Rose Towers because they're just such a great bailout in the opening stages. And then it's down to that sort of secondary stadium, whether you want to play some cemeteries or if you want to play like 1 or 2 Pokestop just for a panic play option if you have to. That's really down to you. And that's kind of where the Lost City is sitting right now. It can give you some peace of mind, but I don't think it's actually like that big of a player. And I think it's going to decrease in play with the Mew lists personally. But I think Mew's obviously still here to stay.
Definitely. Let's take a look at Palkia Intel as well, which we're also going to put in that tier 1 alongside Mew. Palkia, I think, was arguably one of the top decks, even though it wasn't the best performing deck at Worlds or anything. It was still, like, no arguments about it, one of the best decks of the last format, and nothing really changes. It still has the best tutor engine. It still has a fantastic V-Star power that means you can really falter in the first couple of turns and still be representing a huge amount of damage just from one Palkia. Getting one Palkia down on your first turn actually threatens so much. It's crazy. So still really, really strong in terms of like I say, the tutor, the aggression that the deck can provide, and you'll start to see as we build this tier list up, we're in sort of a very aggressive meta right now. So being able to keep up with that is really important. You are a little bit worried here and there about some of the one prize options, but you still have the fallback of being able to attack with Intellion, which is still fantastic, and you can really sort of hone in on that if you are starting to fall a bit concerned with the one prize options, playing an extra shady dealings or whatever, just to make sure you're making your Pokemon as difficult to KO whilst getting really efficient trades on things like Cramorants and stuff is great, to be honest. I think things like Sableye do make you worry a bit here and there about your late game sort of Sobbles and Drizziles and trying to set up checkmate positions through shady dealings, but you still have a fantastic engine, and you can still you still have great access to things like Greninja, which I've just mentioned is really big, and you're one of the only decks playing Manaphy right now, so you can actually really bully some of these other one prize decks if they've chosen to ignore Manaphy. Or to be honest, I think Cologne is still really, really important and maybe even staple in the list right now to be able to make sure you're jumping over those one prize lists. So a combination of things like the Intellion plus Cologne and Greninja can get you there against all of these different decks trying to play these different one prize strategies. And yeah, you're still able to really punish sort of lone 2 prize Pokemon in the early turns in the same way that sort of the Zig Belt combo does in Arceus decks. Palkia does that a lot of the time pretty well. A lot of boards can go quite wide at the moment, especially again, Comfey's under their engine where you're going to want lots of Comfeys down to try and draw cards, and it really puts people in a bit of a spot. How many Comfeys are they allowed to put in play? Are they opening themselves up to a Greninja line? Are they opening themselves up to a Subspace Swell line? Does that mean they draw less cards and all of a sudden maybe they only get one of their V down or stuff like that? It's still a very, very honest deck that keeps other decks honest as well, because it can find what it needs so often with that Drizzile Shady Dealings engine. And yeah, I think there's a couple of new water type Pokemon. We'll talk about Kyurem in a little bit, but I still think just keeping things simple with straight Palkia Intel gives you the best answers or gives you the best options in terms of trying to find what you need, just because you're able to tutor exactly the pieces. You're not worried about drawing them in time. Obviously, with the Comfey engine, you're still drawing a lot of cards, but there'll be times where you whiff, which is way fewer when you have things like heavy Irida count plus the Drizzile engine. You're just going to be able to get all of the pieces you need and make sure opponents are really having to draw well to keep up with you.
Yeah, I definitely agree on Cologne as well. I think that's a top tech card, as well as Empoleon slowing down all these new one prizes, and just the Lost Zone in general. If it's Tina or Gudra, just very good tech include that I think is here to stay. Same thing for the Palkia Kyurem, actually. This has really impressed me as of late. It's had some of the best results out of any of the new decks coming out from the set, actually. And yeah, the deck hits hard, which is basically all you need right now. Basically, having a little Empoleon package covers what we feel are the best one prize decks in not only the Cram builds, but also Gigas, which is seeing a lot of hype. These all get covered pretty hard by a an Empoleon package. You can play as high as 2, by the way. I had 2 in my list on the channel. It invalidates every escape rope, and then you're really hard winning. And it also means you can move your energies onto the other Empoleon as well, so you can just constantly attack, which is insane. And you have such great acceleration for it from not only Star Portal, but also from the Kyurem and the 3 or 4 Cat of Melanie you're probably playing. So yeah, very impressive deck. It's easier than expected to chain Kyurem VMAX attacks as well, which is pretty awesome to see. I think the list that's coming out on top right now has actually cut Bibarrels, which is surprising to me because it's obviously such a powerful card. But having the space to double Guru, double Kyurem just gives you so much burst potential every single turn that you just do not let up. And the 330 hit points, by the way, is freaking massive. That's so insane. Even a Tina that plays a Belt and a Zig can't get there. It has to Requiem, and that's all it has available to it. And if you're getting blocked by Empoleon in the opening stages, you could have fallen too far behind anyway. So yeah, really like this Palkia Kyurem. It hits like a truck, and it seems to be a really good pairing. The only sort of downsides I have for this deck right now is that unlike the Intellion build of Palkia, you don't have comeback mechanic cards. You don't really play any hand disruption, maybe a couple Marnies come into the lists. That's kind of the highest end of disruption I would expect here, because you don't have the same engine to fall back on to actually cycle through the deck. You're really just using buckets to thin all the water energies, then Glaciated Worlding all of those water energies, between Training Court, Greninja, buckets, and using Glaciated World, you're basically just cycling your water energies. You pull them all out of the deck and just use them over and over again to smash, and that's kind of the best way to play the deck right now, I feel. But yeah, no real defense mode cards is the only thing that I sort of have against the deck right now.
Let's take a look at some Arceus variants. So I'm going to actually grab 2 here. Arceus Pika and Arceus Giratina that we're both going to drop in the top of 1.5. I'm picking both of these up because it feels like you can kind of play a mishmash of these decks. Obviously, we saw Andre do incredibly well with the Pika list. And I think there is still, if anything, there is more merit to Pika now than there ever has been, because there's so many one prize decks that are, to be honest, in the format more so than they were back in the day. As well as Palkia still being a huge threat, and we've already mentioned 2 Palkia lists that are up there in tier 1. But the reason why I picked these up is because it feels like you can play kind of Arceus plus a couple of partners based on what you want to target. So we've got Pika here. You can play Aegislash if you're thinking Kyurem is as strong as we are and you really want to try and hone in on that, so that there's basically no Palkia lists out there that really you're struggling with. Obviously, Decidueye is still about if you're still thinking there's a lot of Arceus around. You've got the Dark package for Mew, or you can kind of not necessarily ignore all of that, but instead of playing one of these extra types, you can just throw in a Giratina and try and have just some raw output on your side, rather than trying to rely on weakness. Having the Giratina be able to just sort of start slapping for 280 very, very consistently whilst you're you're tanking yourselves as well as having maybe one of these partners, maybe the Dark package or the Pika package or whatever, to maybe help ease out whichever matchup you're most worried about or you're most expecting at a tournament. It feels like a combination of these 3 partners, Arceus plus 2 friends per se, and kind of reflecting on what you think the meta is going to be. It seems like it could be one of the best ways to play Arceus, to be honest. I think there's obviously sort of consistency issues here and there. You're not an Intellion engine, and you're not a Comfey engine. You're typically a barrel engine, which by design probably draws the least out of all of these engines, because it's not always the easiest to thin your hand down, and obviously Comfey always draws cards or whatever. Same with Intellion, always finding what you need. So I think the biggest sort of hurdle is just trying to make it all fit in and work. But we've seen from successful lists that Arceus plus 2 partners plus a barrel engine can definitely work, and it's just about picking out those partners and picking exactly what you think is going to be the best for the tournament that you're going into. But I think this is one of the, if not the best way to try and counter a lot of different decks at once, is trying to find a couple of partners for Arceus to play around with.
And in a shocking twist, our highest rated Arceus right now is Arceus Aggron. Didn't think I would be saying that, but there's so much to like, specifically in this little micro meta that we're in, where the Kyurem part of Palkia is one of the most popular decks in the game. So you have some very powerful type coverage at your disposal for up trading. And you also just have that raw damage output that I think is kind of important right now when the meta is so wide, when, like you say, you can play this Pikachu plus X, but the X never feels good enough because it only targets like 8% of the field. Whereas just having Aggron's raw damage output, similar to the Giratina, is just so high that you just smash, really. And it's a really good approach. I also love having like the thick belt and zig package, so you really punish slower starts with that star birth. You can easily be bossing up, any 220 hit point mon and just dealing with it. So you can initiate that sort of 2-2-2 race so nicely. You have that fallback of star birth and the barrel that you're just consistent. So yeah, I really like the Aggron build, actually. I think it's the strongest way to play Arc, at least from the meta that we've seen in the last the last week, really. It feels like my go-to pick.
Yeah. Let's take on some of these sort of tier 4 fun tier decks that we're going to rattle off. I think Dugong and Rapid Mally, I think, are the first ones that we'll just throw in there. Both really fun. I think they actually are surprisingly similar when you actually look at how the decks function. I actually slightly prefer Dugong to Rapid Mally, I think, just because it feels like you get to draw more cards. But obviously there's a lot of things like the Sableye, like the fact that you probably have to play Manaphy just to not be crushed by a Greninja. All of these kind of things are a bit annoying. There's still hand disruption that can always be a bit annoying, as well as just naturally being a one prize deck, but being slower than these basic decks. It's not necessarily that difficult for a Cram to start hitting you straight away, and realistically, even if they don't, they can catch up later on, whether it be, like I say, through a Sableye or a Greninja. So whilst they're pretty fun, and they're actually one prize decks that have a decent damage cap against some of these two prize decks, in the same way that sort of Rapid Mally was one of the only one prize decks that could keep up with some of the Arceus decks back in sort of Liverpool time. It feels like there's too many other one prize answers, and there's too many options in the other one prize decks for them to actually be able to crack open the format.
For sure. I want to talk about a pet deck of mine. It's going to be Hisuian VSTAR. It's a deck that I really, really like, and I think less is more with Gudra. I think its own attack text is so good that just getting it online turn 2 provides the highest win rate for the deck. And that's why, similar to the channel list, I've simplified it as much as possible to just get going. Having Melanie as the fallback means you don't need to be hitting your Mirage Gates on turn 2. You can just Melanie attach slowly and get there. You also have the backup Cram as just like a one prize threat, so you can represent a pretty awkward prize map for the opponent almost always with one prize attacks from Cramorant, but also from the Radiant Greninja, who is an all-star in the deck, draws you cards, has the Mirage Gate pivots to turn into a double snipe, which is really nice in the meta, where there's so many V-Stars out there that you can set up 2 at once, or you can take a one prize knockout and set up one, or one that you've already hit with a Rolling Iron, you can go for that play. Yeah, it's a pretty simple deck in its purpose, in that you're literally just trying to announce the Rolling Iron, be a problem, have that annoying hit points to deal with, have the inbuilt V-Star power that can just heal at any point for a free turn. And let me tell you, when we're playing like 4 or 5 turn games of Pokemon at the moment, a free turn is absurd, and you go into every game basically knowing that you have a free turn. That's just so insane. So yeah, I think the deck is very solid. Right now, from the early results, it seems like builds more similar to mine, where it's, doesn't have all the bells and whistles, maybe like 1 or 2 Fantina maximum is kind of what's been working best. And I feel like that's the better way to go, rather than going full tank, because I think in general tanking is kind of invalidated by certainly the Kyurem success that we've seen, but also potentially some Giratina success. So yeah, I like a simple approach, but I think it's got a pretty decent matchup spread into the top meta decks right now.
Yeah. Let's talk about Blissey. Blissey is going to be our first tier 3 deck. Blissey is actually a deck that I think was in a decent position sort of at the end of the last format, and it's one that really surprised me, to be honest. But in general, it really capitalized on the fact that the format was pretty capped on the amount of damage it could do, and Giratina has basically blown that wide open. They have an auto KO, which is pretty crazy, but also just actually having like 280 means that you're forced to have the cape on all the time, and naturally they play Lost Vacuum to try and get rid of that anyway. But also, just your healing is less effective because you need to heal so much now to be able to actually completely invalidate one of their turns. It's actually really, really difficult to do, as well as basically being the Miltanks being basically pointless because Giratina even got Shred. It feels like they really gave everything to Giratina. There's a lot more, like just the existence of more damage in the format, even things like Kyurem just having an unlimited damage cap. That kind of stuff naturally makes it less favorable a format for Blissey. I still think it has merit here and there, and like a big Blissey at the end of the day can really crush some of these one prize decks because you can, if you're able to get to the point where you have a big Blissey, all of the sniping and stuff that they can do really isn't that worrisome. You can heal off things quite well. Even things like gift energy and stuff that we got actually helps the deck flow a bit more. But I think just the natural raw aggression of the format and two of the very high tier decks having a very high damage output makes things a lot worse for Blissey going into some of these matchups where usually the damage cap would have hopefully got you, it will sort of seen you through with big Blisseys.
And essentially everything you just said about Blissey is the same for Mewtwo, but just kind of like enhanced. We feel like this is just a deck that no longer should really exist in the game. There's Empoleon around every corner. It can be in Kyurem, it can be in Palkia Intel, it can even be in Hisuian Zoroark if you want, and that's all big trouble for a deck that's trying to Gormandize its way through the deck. Obviously, Miltank doesn't slow them down, and certainly if they're the Kyurem build, they have massive one-hit KO potential, which is a huge issue. You do protect yourself from Star Requiem, of course, but again, like Jack said, they can just build a board where they can hit twice for 280, and that's still like a huge issue for you. I'm also just going to finish off by bunging in the Lunar Rock as well, because this also is a massive victim of the amount of Empoleon that I'm sort of expecting to see. And again, if you're playing a water package in Mirage Gate, easily Gudra could play Empoleon, easily like a one prize Cram could play an Empoleon. If we start seeing more and more of Confei Engine succeed, there's more and more reason for Empoleon to be a factor in the game, and that just hits us in the crossfire massively.
Yeah, and just also rounding that up, I'm going to grab Stonejourner and drop it in 3 as well, just because, again, kind of looping back to whole Giratina's damage output, it's actually, again, less so the damage output and more so Star Requiem just sort of going through, and meaning that the lone Stonejourner board that just lived against absolutely anything with Stone Gift and all of these Stone Energy and the tools and stuff, it means that you can't do that anymore, and that means that they have an opportunity to just start bullying the other Stonejourner that doesn't have all of the bells and whistles, and eventually they can very easily get to the point where a Star Requiem just kills the one that you've had to invest everything into. Again, there's definitely merit to the deck in certain instances, but I think the existence of Giratina has meant that it's way harder to create like an unlosable board state with a Stonejourner if you're able to get to that point in the game anymore.
Yeah, and I guess that brings us to the big elephant in the room, the Giratina VSTAR deck. We are bumping it into tier 1, we're bumping it pretty high, and this deck is actually, after playing it, way more flexible than I initially thought. I initially thought big dude do big number, and that's just a great reason to play the deck. But it turns out it's actually much more intricate and has a lot of interesting lines available to it. We've already seen some really interesting lists. We've even seen Thornton packages going into Giratina from Gustavo Wada, where you basically can burst a Tina out of nowhere because you can Thornton Mirage Gate attach smack, which is really scary as a proposition at any turn in the game, that just like anything in your active position could just turn into being dead, especially because you could just Requiem even a 3 prize Pokemon. So that's really scary. I like that you have the option to play Water Energy and Greninja, because it's always going to play Radiant Greninja, but if you play the mini package of like 1 Cram, 1 Greninja, 1 Sableye, you can do a lot in 1 prize matchups and just represent a 1 prize board state against other aggressive decks, and it means that you're not just like completely blown up by someone bossing a Giratina on turn 2 before you got to boss them kind of thing. So you can represent really annoying board states for people whilst having this big smack in the back whenever you needed to, or if you have gone first or whatever, you can have the license to put your Tina down and be pressurizing a huge amount of damage onto multiple prize threats. So I think this is actually a way cuter deck than I initially expected. I thought it was just going to be like a big smack deck, and Cram was just like a panic option because you didn't get enough to Mirage Gate or whatever. But I do really think this has a ton going for it, and we are already seeing lots of splinters off of different ways to play it. We've got a water package with Greninja if you respect one prize decks or want to have some extra flexibility. We have some Sableye that can come in. We have the Leafeon package, which I'm still a fan of, by the way, especially if we are in heavy 2 and 3 prize metas. I still feel like it's very reasonable. Even just playing the regular Leafeon V is a popular choice right now. So there's lots of variety in Giratina, and lots of them are succeeding in the early stages of this metagame. So that just tells you so much about the power of the deck, and how it can still navigate the metagame as it sort of winds up and changes throughout the next few weeks.
Yeah. Let's talk about Reggies. Reggies, I think, is always one of these decks that people love to back. And it gained some pretty cool options. I think the big thing coming out of Lost Origin was, can you play the Thornton package, and can you use the Reggie ability to set up cooler things than just these 6 Reggies that already were pretty good, to be honest. They cover a lot of different types. They have a lot of options. And it turns out, whilst you can, it really hurts the deck's consistency, and that's not what Reggie needs. Reggie needs to be as consistent as possible because they're the only games it's winning. When it does that, it wins them pretty well because it has actually great efficiency in terms of how it trades into 2 prizes and things like that. But in general, the Thornton package doesn't help that as much as it initially seemed. Some worries for Reggie. We've touched on Lost World a little bit. Sorry, Lost City a little bit. I'm with Joe. I don't think it's as big of a factor in the format as it necessarily may seem, but it is something that you have to keep in mind in terms of there could be random decks that have a Lost City or 2, and because of that, they just bully a certain type of Reggie or whatever, and all of a sudden they lock you out of the game. I think the bigger issue more so is the one that we've been mentioning this whole time is there's more Empoleons about, and more Empoleons makes life so much more difficult. It means that you actually have to either manually attach or find a way around the Empoleon, which typically is not the easiest for the Reggie deck, because the lists are always a little bit wacky. You're playing some funky counts here and there, and you're playing like a crazy energy count and stuff like that. So that's the biggest sort of issue for the Reggie deck. I actually think it trades into a lot of these decks still pretty well, though. Anything that's not playing an Empoleon, Reggie still has really decent typing, to be honest. There's a lot of good Reggies out there. There's a lot of options here and there. I think you're big enough against some of these other 1 prize decks that if they're not playing the 1 prize, if they're not playing the Empoleon, you can sometimes be a little bit too big for them, especially against things like Cramorant and stuff, that you can sometimes overwhelm them. But I think typically the lists that get to play the Sableye and stuff will eventually be able to take out multiple Reggies at once. They'll just be cramming here and there, and then we'll try and set it up so that maybe they've fallen behind a prize or 2, but they've gained that back, plus also done a lot more to your board state than you have to theirs. So there's definitely things to worry about. I still think it can trade quite well into some of these 2 prize decks, though, like I say. So I think the biggest issue is just the presence of Empoleon, and the more decks that try Empoleon, the same way we've been saying about a lot of these decks, the more decks that find space for Empoleon, the less good Reggies will be.
Certainly. Let's look at the deck that I am now starting to experiment with. The new age of Urshi may have arrived. A Mirage Gate Urshifu is something me and Jack are very excited to start testing, really. It's actually similar to the Cramorant deck that's just next to it, where it's going to be 1 prizing around, has Greninja, and has a Sableye. The Urshifu will have all of those things, but you also have the similar package that Wada has with his Giratina deck, but with an Urshifu instead, and you can gate and use GMAX Rapid Flow instead. So very flexible, very interesting deck that we're sort of cooking up right now. Basically just a higher damage output build of the 1 prize Cram deck that also has great typing into Arceus that we feel is certainly a strong deck. And Arceus is one of the more difficult matchups for the Cram deck. Certainly if it's like an Arc Barrel with Sharon's Care, that's when it's really bad. If it's an Intellion with Sharon's Care, you can sometimes get there just because you can Sableye their guys and you can Greninja down their stuff. But if it's a Bibarel build with Sharon's, then it's terrible for you. But the Urshifu completely flips that matchup on a dime. Now you're going to be bodying most Arc matchups because, again, even if they play Manaphy Dunce at this point, that's just really good for you because you're going to have the Sableye package sprinkling over them. So that's just so silly. They're giving you free prizes because they have to, but it's just like more good news for you. You have the early tempo from the Cram, and you have a way to attack into Empoleon way earlier than these Cram decks as well, because if you see an Empoleon come down from one of these water decks or whatever, you can just bench Urshi, attach, and then you're threatening Gale Thrust straight away. And I know you're not instantly knocking out the Empoleon, but you're putting a good enough damage on it that you can Rapid Flow it later. So that's obviously very strong. So I feel like the Urshi could be yet another way that we can be seeing this Mirage Gate succeed. Admittedly, this is more theory than gameplay right now, but I am really enthusiastic about the potential of Urshifu. And I feel like, again, we're once again talking about so many decks today. It's a testament to how diverse the meta is likely to be. And it means that Arceus probably won't afford to fit Dunsparce in their deck list. And that's just very good for you. I feel like the only reason you would have to play Dunsparce right now is if Reggie starts climbing the ladder in the tier list. If the Hisuian Arcanine starts doing a lot better, then maybe there's a reason to start playing some Desi. Or if we see some Dunsparce, or if we see Hisuian Decidueye like kind of go back into the peak list or something, maybe there are reasons. But if you can dodge or pick those moments, you can really be punishing with the Urshifu package. So yeah, I think this has a ton of potential, and that's kind of just been unlocked to us because we've started to see some Thornton Tina actually. But copy pasting that into a very versatile attacker also seems like a great idea.
Yeah. Let's talk about the other Urshi. Urshi Intel. We're going to drop in tier 3. Urshi, I mean, for all the same reasons that Urshi is powerful, this is why it's not all the way down at the bottom. But as we've mentioned, being able, like, an Intellion engine is quite scary right now. And I think this is the first time we've ever had one Intellion engine, like, anywhere near the top. Usually these tier lists are littered with Intellion with X. So you can see that this is maybe not the best time to be playing Intel right now. Urshi again naturally has all of those great benefits that Joe just mentioned, but I think in general I'm more like we say, we're more liking the sound of being able to play the Comfey engine and the One Prize engine and that kind of stuff, rather than leaving yourself exposed to having your Sobbles and Drizzles and stuff bullied anyway, as well as naturally, I think, not being able to compete with some of these decks as well, because Urshi takes time to get there and it likes to sort of be a bit more of a combo based deck. Whereas with the sort of the Mirage Gate One Prize engine, you actually get to do stuff in the early turns. You're not reliant on having multiple prize Pokemon out. You're actually sort of doing tempo plays. You're dealing some damage early on with Cram that you can capitalize on later. You're even getting things like things like Sableye, I guess, early enough to be able to at least be doing things just more so than the old Intellion list could. I think it's difficult to justify an Intellion deck over a Comfey deck at the moment. I think Palkia is one of the only ones that can really do it. But like I say, Urshi in general, I think is potentially in a very solid meta placement regardless. So it just squeaks into that tier 3 just because it's naturally quite a good deck outside of everything else.
Next up, let's talk about Palkia Ice Rider. This is almost suffering from the success of the Kyurem, which I think is kind of funny, because although you're very good at dealing with V-Star Pokemon, you're quite bad into Mew, and you're quite bad into this new mirror match that you're having to come up against, and you may get caught into the crossfire of random metal stuff being around, like Aggron or like Pika adding in a metal package or something like that as well. So I feel like this deck is just kind of less versatile than the Kyurem, where it just has extra burst potential. I initially thought this was like more work and sometimes doesn't quite get there as much as the Ice Rider, that's just like stable damage output that almost always gets online and has turn 2 tempo a lot more often than the Kyurem will. And that's only really good into V-Star matchups, but you know, even all these decks can be representing V-Stars, obviously, but like the Palkia can have a lot of 1-prize attacking options. The Mew is obviously going to have a 1-prize in the opening stages and is a 3-prize Pokemon, so it isn't so easily dealt with by the Ice Rider. The Kyurem is one of the matchups where they can one-shot your 3-prizer and you can't. and the Giratina can be very flexible as well. So you're not going to be represented by a turn 2 V-Star anywhere near as much anymore. So I think everything is just going to be more flexible around the Ice Rider, and that's kind of why we're dropping it down the tiers a little bit, because it's going to suffer from all the Kyurem stuff and probably be bad in what would be like a kind of mirror match as well.
Talking about metal types, let's take a look at Dialga, and to be honest, it's never really been better to be a metal type right now. It's pretty good typing to be, just because you're able to bully one of the new Palkia decks. I think in general, obviously, this feels like a very feast or famine deck. It always has, and there'll be turns where you slip up, and there'll be games where you slip up and you don't quite reach the combo, or there'll be games where you reach the combo and you basically destroy anything that's in front of you because you've been able to get 2 turns on turn 2, and it doesn't matter what your opponent's playing. You've taken like 3 or 4 prizes at that point. Feels very much the same, at least now. Kyurem is a big enough part of the format that, at least in that matchup, you can actually just make tempo plays. You can make tempo attacks because you're up trading against them typically. Obviously, there are still concerns here and there about sort of your board state, and I think the Mew engine is getting a lot worse now that Greninja, but now that Sableye is a bit part of the metagame. I think the engine is way worse, and your Mews are way less safe. You have to net them up prematurely a lot more often. But I think the typing is great right now. I think Dialga has this notion of, realistically, it can be anything if it pops off in the first couple of turns. It doesn't really matter what you're playing against, because you can just bully people with Chrono Star. So it's a really interesting one. I think it's what it gains from being a metal type in a world of Kyurem. It loses from all of these decks that get to play Sableye, but you're still able to keep up with a lot of these other decks just by having a great V-Star power. So it feels like one of these decks which will probably always stay around that tier 2, unless something massive means that it can never be played, because it will always have that cheese factor. But I think this is the engine that we're looking at, and the turbo engine in general, I think is really, really taking a step back, because Comfey, if nothing else, Comfey has 10 more HP, which is actually massive, because it means that you can't be bullied. You can't take 2 prizes with a Sableye without additional pings or whatever. And that's actually a really, really big deal. So, I think a turbo engine now is going to look more towards Comfey than Mew. Maybe there's somewhere for like a Mirage Gate turbo engine Dialga deck. We don't know. That's like it feels like the Lawson engine is so broad it could even get to that. But that's where we feel Dialga is falling right now.
I'm going to talk about Hisuian Zoroark. It's definitely a deck that I'm kind of hot on right now. And I feel like the format so far that we've seen in this week, they've all been playing it one way. They've all been playing 4 DTE, sometimes like a couple of basic Psych Energies, and that's it. And you're trying to be this deck that can reach 310 or whatever as quickly as possible, and you're just going to race. And you're just going to hit 2 prize Pokemon. And for me, I think that's okay into some of the decks above it, but also like not good enough against like the Cram 1 prizes, not good against like the Urshifu, not even good against the Gudra in often circumstances. So you can do this like cool I'm a racing 2 prize deck thing pretty consistently, right? Because you have the inbuilt V-Star power, you have a lot of dig potential. We've seen now that the combination of Bog, Pump, and Gengar gets that going quickly enough. That's not the problem. I think the problem is that you're basically a dodge and weave deck. From the list that we've seen so far, you can race effectively, but if you're not in one of those good matchups, you're just going to do badly. So the other alternative is similar to what we had on the channel. I think the critical error I made in my channel list actually was not playing Crobat. But I think had I played Crobat in my list, it would be like way closer to where I think Zoroark will end up, where it plays a couple Empoleon and plays that Diancie. It means that going second, you have that escape routes where you can go into a Diancie or you can go into an Empoleon. Again, we've been singing the praise of Empoleon this whole time. It's easily going into the Palkia list, but I think it also works well enough in the Zoro list to disrupt the Comfey engines out there, which, look how many Mirage Gates and look how many Cramorants are up there at the top. The Empoleon is a big disruptor of that. Also having Melanie Capture Energy, and crucially, having Greninja at your disposal gives you the option to have like extra draw. So on your turn where you go research plus V-Star power, you also have that Greninja that can get you 2 to 4 more cards if you play net or whatever. So you can really make those deeper pushes. You have a better time into one prize matchups with the Empoleon, and you actually respect the Confe engine essentially by doing this. And you're also able to beat the Reggie deck, which is otherwise like one of your worst matchups. Even with Dunsparce, it's easily one of your worst matchups because the Dunsparce has to be damaged, and the Regieleki will be like eating it alive, right? So I think you're just not covering enough bases with the list that we've seen so far with Zoro, and maybe that's the issue. Like maybe playing the Empoleon and the Melanies and this sort of stuff doesn't consistently enough work that you don't then beat the stuff above you in the tier list and don't race effectively enough. But I think in general, having Diancie as a backup plan and having Empoleon is going to be the way to go in the future, because you actually then are able to like face any deck in the format. You're just a little bit watered down from this hyper aggressive 4 energy plus Silene deck, which clearly isn't the right way to play it. It's just like the most fun way to play it on ladder right now.
Let's take a look at Arc Intel. Once touted as basically the best deck in format, we think it's all the way down in tier 2 now. Not necessarily bad. I still think Arceus is, or Arc Intel represents the best shooter in the game. It can pick out exactly what it wants to do every turn. I still think it's one of the best Marnie Path decks. It's still got Sharon Care options, which are still really important. But two things that we've kind of emphasized all the way through is the Intellion engine is in a bit of a shaky spot right now, being able to be punished in the late game or even mid game by things like Sableye can actually make it quite difficult to chain sort of the Sharon's Care combos that the deck naturally had. And those Sharon Care combos are actually a little bit worse as well, just because there's more one shot in the format. Arceus in general just gets cleanly KO'd by a Giratina without a big charm. They can then play an array of different ways to get around the big charm. You've got Kyurem as well that can push over your big charm and make it so that you're able to make it so that they're able to not worry about this sort of Sharon's Care looping plan that you used to do. I think the deck still keeps a lot of decks honest. I think some of the one prize decks, especially if they're not able to get into that Sableye, it can be difficult for them to overcome some big Arceuses. But like Joe said earlier on, I think big Arceus with Bibarel is actually a way more threatening engine, because whilst they're able to still take a KO on the Bibarel, being able to set up a couple of Bibarels and not leave yourself completely stranded, whereas losing out on Sobbles and Drizzars in the mid game can be really, really crucial. I think that makes it a little bit less scary for these one prize decks. The deck, obviously, like I say, boasts the best search engine in the game, and it's going to mean that it's going to be able to do what it wants a lot of times. But I think in general, it's just there's a lot of things that have come out that have made things a bit scarier, and it feels like you're constantly sort of looking over your shoulder at sort of what these new decks can do, and also just the unknown sort of factor of how. Where is this Mirage Gate engine going? Are there going to be more things that we find that can deal massive amounts of damage? Are we going to start to see more fighting decks doing well, so that you're forced to play things like the Dunsparce that we mentioned earlier on, that you're really not happy playing just in general, but also it's easy prizes for some of these other decks. Typically, things like the Mirage Gate engines are going to be playing Sableye anyway, so it all gets a bit awkward here and there. Obviously, still a very, very consistent deck in terms of getting what it needs to do done, and still one of the more disruptive decks in the format for sure. I think only second to like Andre's flying Pika list in terms of being able to really punish people with Marnie Path. But I think there's some definite worries in that tier 1 category that make its typical strategy of just being a massive dude and trying to take 6 prizes more quickly than your opponent. I think it just falls in that aspect compared to Goodra. I think Goodra does it way better. So I think Arc Intel has to really adapt in terms of working out what its new game plan is against some of these new matchups.
For sure. And I think the world's one-hit wonder of the just rinse and repeat Lizard deck is in a far worse place, unfortunately, in this format. It's a shame, because I actually really love playing this deck as well. And I was testing it pre-Worlds, and Cawthorn brought a really interesting deck to the table, and it was amazing to see it functioning. But it even gains some new cards in the set as well, like gaining a Snorlax as an additional attacker that is like kind of lower maintenance but can still take advantage of like Raihan Twin much more easily is such an appealing card to add to the deck. So I thought it was gaining stuff from this set, but it's getting caught in the Lost City Crossfire And it really affects this deck hard, because obviously the Lizard should be taking like the majority of your prizes, and even just the Intellions not being able to be Clara'd back is a huge no-no for you. It basically defeats the deck on the spot. And you're also so punished by, if Palkia's playing Cologne, all of these Lost Zone engines that can play those Sableyes, it's so vital for you, similar to Rapid Mally in a lot of ways, where you just need to have your Sobbles and Drizzles floating around on the board. You literally can't not have them in play because they're so important for you to get the next combo piece and the next combo piece. So yeah, it's just a real shame for this deck, because I think it's a sweet deck, but I think Zard now has to be put into other builds as much less of a mainstay, and just kind of like has to be content by being the finisher, taking the last 2 prizes, or taking the last 3 prizes or something, where you recycle it once, not the full 4 times that Cawthorn was going for.
Let's take a look at Hisuian Arcanine. I'm going to pick the last 1 prize deck on the list. This is obviously a hark back to Gramble. I think arguably with better typing, which is great. I think there's been some pretty interesting lists go around. I'm not convinced that this is going anywhere higher than tier 2, unfortunately. I think it's going to be one of these decks that sticks around tier 2, but I actually think it could stay around here and maybe even creep up to towards the top of tier 2. It looks like lists are now using that Zoroark engine that a lot of Japanese lists were doing. It looks like they've adopted that over here as well. And the new thing, or the one thing that was really cool to see was the Slowbro that Joe was. I was chatting to Joe about this before the tier list, and I think it's like the best. I think it's the best ever Zoroark is going to get in terms of being or really unleashing its full potential as a deck. It's actually a deck where you're really using Zoroark. You're looking to or you'll have multiple ways of getting your attacker out, and Zoroark's just supplementary. So yeah, I probably should have popped a Zoroark on here rather than a Guru, but yeah, it's a really cool deck. I think it's the best way we've seen Zorobox. I think it's actually the most versatile way we've seen Zorobox, and actually gets to use cards like Mightyena and Slowbro that, to be honest, are very, very powerful cards. I think in general it's going to struggle with some of the different decks around here. I think some of the 1 prize decks are a bit spooky. Your draw engine isn't naturally as good. I think you have Tempting Tune and Altara and Guru to help get you through, but that's obviously that's a bit more setup than just immediately being able to draw cards from Comfey and stuff. So I think there's issues with the consistency, but I think it's actually impressed me in terms of its results so far. And I'm looking forward to having a mess around with it a bit more. I don't think it's ever going to be taking anything down in terms of regionals, but I think here and there we'll see 1 or 2 making it into day 2, and I think it seems like a lot of fun to play, to be honest. And the typing is also pretty good right now.
That means that we're left with Arcdura. People in chat always say that we underrate this deck, and we're bugging it in tier 3 again. No changes there. Similar to what we were saying about some of these other decks, like the Mewtwo, the Blissey, the Stonejourner. These were the densest decks in the format. They were the biggest things, the biggest walls that we could create. And what's the point in a wall these days when there's a Kyurem and there's a Star Requiem staring you down? Even Zoroark, if they play the Melanies, is a huge issue for this sort of deck. So, yeah, you're still vulnerable in those opening stages. That much has never changed. Mew is going up in play from my estimations, from at least the previous format and from like World's meta. And you're still weak into anything that plays Echoing Horn, so Palkia still playing Horn is still pretty bad for you, I would say. So yeah, it's still this deck that's very vulnerable in the opening stages in terms of not having any way to draw more than like 2 cards. And very reliant on turn 2 Starbirth. If it doesn't come off, the deck crumbles. And there's no reason to tank in the game anymore. I think the best upsides of this deck is right now exactly you punish bad Zoro lists and you punish Reggies. Like, that's the best upside for this deck right now. And that's just like, that can't be correct. so we're going to be bugging it in tier 3. I think if you want to tank Gudra is like by far the better one. And actually me and Jack were having that discussion about Arc Gudra as a potential like stepping stone from this sort of archetype. I personally don't think it's correct to play Arc Gudra because the regular Duraludon V at least has good tankability and good size to it, which the regular Gudra doesn't. It gets punished just the same way that an Arceus or whatever else could be picked off from the bench very easily. And also, using Trinity Nova onto a Goodra then means the Goodra is only set at that 270 threshold, which is far lower than powering up like a Dura V-Star with this annoying ability as well. So I think you almost always lose out on the Moisture Star V-Star power if you play an Arc Goodra, and that's one of the biggest selling points of the Goodra. That's why it's a tank, right? So that's why Duraludon is still probably better than an Arc Goodra. But like I just said, there's not a whole heap of reasons to play this sort of deck.
Yeah. And that's the tier list. We're going to leave it below as well, so you can create your own. Feel free to share them with us on social media and stuff. We're always interested in seeing how other people rank their tiers, as well as just dropping it in the comments where you think we've maybe missed something, or maybe even missed a deck that needs to be added on here, or maybe we've rated something too low or too high. We're always really interested to hear your thoughts as to where you think the meta's going. It's going to be really interesting. We have one more weekend of Astral Radiance, and then we are full force. The next tournaments IRL will be Lost Origin, so we'll finally get to see some of these cards in action in IRL tournaments, which is going to be really exciting to see, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think we have a lot of decks on here right now. Normally at the start of a format, you'll see that we have lots of things, and then, as the weeks go by, some of these drop off, and I'm sure some of that will happen, especially with like the tier 4 stuff. They'll be not on the next tier list, for example, and maybe even some of the tier 3s if they just completely fall off the map. But I think the amount of decks we have in tier 1 and 1.5 is way higher than a lot of the previous tier lists that we've done. We think there's just a dense amount of decks that are reasonable to play right now, and are very flexible, really. So the new cards that we've got from Lost Origin are so awesome. I think they've made the game the healthiest it's been for a long time, and I wasn't necessarily expecting that from the get-go, but it's been a wild ride testing right now. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, just look at in those top two tiers, like you say, this will definitely be filtered out when we actually start to see some more results and we have a bit more data to back this up. But look at the array of different strategies that these decks possess. It's like there's 4 different engines. In fact, there's almost 5 different engines in tier 1, which is crazy. And all 5 of them, it's not like you're forcing one into any of these decks. It feels like all 5 of these engines are very justified in the decks they're within.
Mm-hmm.
It starts to get a little bit less diverse as you go down, but the fact that, in our opinion, the top 5 decks in the format all run on a different engine means that, if more than ever, we can actually play the game and we can do exactly what we want, and we can really start to see how these cards sort of fare up in these games. So yeah, really, really exciting place to be with the new Lost Origin cards. I think it's been a very, very good start, at least, for this set in the competitive scene.
So that just about wraps things up. It's been almost an hour, so I hope you stuck with us and enjoyed. We'll be back tomorrow with some more content, and we've got to do a top 10 decks before the first event of Lost Origin, so look out for those as well, because we're ironing out the 60s as they go. I'm sure they would have changed already from some of the lists you've seen. So yeah, see you next time. Cheers.